Hello and welcome to Android Developer Backstage. I'm Romain and Tor from the Android Toolkit team.
I'm Tor Norby from the Android Studio team.
I'm Chet from Chicago.
And I'm Sebastiano from the Android Dev UX team.
Before we get started, Tor, can you, I have to ask, why is Chet here?
I'm not. I'm in Chicago. We covered this.
Did you forget to take him off the calendar and not for anything?
I think so, yes. Now it's becoming awkward, so we'll pretend that it was the plan all along.
Yeah.
Hey guys, what are we going to talk about today? This is fun.
So Android Dev UX team.
Yes.
What do you work on?
So I am a UX engineer, which, as I found out when I joined Google, is a software engineer that does a lot of UX, which is right down my alley. In particular, what I'm working on is a lot of UI and UX concerns in Android Studio. So I've worked on bringing the new UI that the IntelliJ platform introduced a couple of years back on Studio, making sure that everything worked fine. I've worked on the UI for the Gemini and Android Studio plugin.
Also known as StudioBot.
Yeah.
Formerly. Yep.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Love that name.
Yep.
And now I'm working also on Joule, which is a library from JetBrains that we are using to enable a lot of new interesting features and UI experiments in Android Studio.
So Joule is like a Swing library or something?
No, it's a Compose for desktop library. Surprise.
So I was going to ask, before we talk about what you're working on right now, could you, for the listeners who are most likely mobile developers, could you give them some context on what kind of libraries, languages do we use to build Android Studio and its UI? How does that work?
So probably people are aware that Android Studio is based on the IntelliJ platform, which is built by JetBrains, and on which almost every IDE that JetBrains builds is based upon. Studio is essentially IntelliJ community with a lot of customizations that we bring to make Android development easier and more productive. Now, because the IntelliJ platform is 20-something years old, it uses 20-something-year-olds technology in some of its parts. Obviously, it keeps evolving over time, like they've introduced Kotlin a few years ago. Now they're introducing coroutines in the platform, but the core of the platform is still 20-something years old. So there is a lot of Java. There is a lot of futures, I think. There is a lot of Swing, in case you...
So Swing is Swing is the UI toolkit that is part of the Java for desktop platform.
Yeah, Java C, I think, is the...
I've lost track of the name. Yeah, J2SE 5.0 version 1.5. Yeah, it's interesting because it's a bit dear to our hearts because Tor, you used Swing when you worked on previous IDEs, right?
Yes, and for a while I was on the Java team at Sun Microsystems, not Swing, but the successor team, JavaFX, and of course both Chet and Romain were on the Swing team, right?
Actually, we met.
So we have to be careful what we say about Swing, even though...
Chet and actually I met when we were working on Swing together.
Yeah.
So blast from the past.
But it's dated.
So they're still doing active development with Swing? Like, I assume so, like maintenance mode of those components anyway. I don't mean of Swing, I mean of the IDE using the Swing stuff. Do you know?
Well, I mean, so we're probably going to get into that, right? But so until recently, yes, all new features, and including the StudioBot UI. So Seb wrote most of the UI for StudioBot last year. And that was all in Swing.
Yes.
Right? So basically, if you want to do UI in Studio, Swing is what you want to do. But that's changing. And that's kind of why we thought, hey, let's have Seb on the podcast and talk about the new sort of UI direction for what we're doing in the IDE.
Yeah, so Swing is a technology that is at this point almost 30 years old. It still works, and particularly in IntelliJ platform, there is a lot of structure built on top of Swing that makes it easier, less error prone, and also looking a bit nicer than the default.
And also imagine a lot of custom components for the needs of the IDE.
Yeah, that's how the new UI looks so clean, is that it's not, if you look at an old Swing app, remember the metal look and feel?
Oh, yeah.
You could tell when it was a Swing app. And I think this one looks quite modern, despite what's sitting underneath of it.
Yeah.
The official name was the purpley bumpy look and feel, I think.
Yeah.
That's what I called it. Yeah.
It definitely looks way more modern than you would expect from something like Swing, but they've put a lot of effort into it. They built a lot of components that are custom, that are maybe partly based on the Swing core components, but they have completely custom rendering code. They have custom behaviors. And on top of everything else, they've built a theming system, which is what the IntelliJ platform themes are based on. That is...
Well, on top of that, sorry, I was going to add for folks who are not familiar with Swing, Swing has the concept of what's called pluggable look and feel. So there is a centralized way that you can customize the look and feel of all the components in the application. And Swing apps were kind of famous/infamous for giving users the ability to choose themselves which theme they wanted, and those could be pretty extensive. So this is in contrast with the Vue system, where we do have theming support, but it doesn't go as far as what you can do with Swing.
Yeah, in Swing, for example, you can build the so-called UI of a component. So a component in and by itself doesn't necessarily know how to render itself, but the theme can say, oh, to render a button, you should use the Darkula button UI, which is the IntelliJ platform UI. And that will know how to interpret the values that you have.
But the key is that it's not just the rendering, it's also the behaviors, right? Like how you handle
Yes.
the mouse and keyboard. And
there is some behavior in some components, but not all of them.
Right.
Because obviously...
By the way, so my point was, that's how also I imagine how JetBrains was able to like deliver this new modern look and feel. It's like based on what Swing offers, plus their own layers on top.
Yeah, essentially, the way they swapped from the old look and feel to the new look and feel was, surprisingly enough, with very, very few code changes. A lot of changes have come in terms of just the theme. Because in IntelliJ platform, they have essentially a JSON format that you can use to define keys for like colors, dimensions, a lot of metrics and borders, margins, whatnot. And that gets read when the IDE starts, and it becomes the runtime theme that you can choose in the IDE. And then those values are put in the look and feel, the pluggable look and feel that Swing uses. And then the UI components will read the values from there and use them to render. So the reason why you can, even now in the IntelliJ platform, you can switch quickly without restarting the IDE from the old UI to the new UI, because at the end of the day, most of the changes are just like, oh, we're just going to use different colors and invalidate everything. And now you have the new UI or you have the old UI. There are a few if-else.
There's always, I remember, in fact, when I worked on StudioBot, right? Like you were only working on, I think, the new theme and only like the light theme or something. And I'm a dark theme person, right? And I was like, this doesn't work, right? So like, it's not like there still is, a bunch of, in fact, that's what you did first, right? Was when you went through and tried to make Studio work with the new themes, because there's a bunch of places where we weren't doing quite the right thing and we needed to tweak things to make them.
Yeah, because of the theming engine being as pluggable as it is, you have to use it everywhere, because if you somewhere, it's like on Android, if you hard code a string and don't use the string resource, then if you change language, that string is not going to be updated. And the same thing goes in the IntelliJ platform. So if you hard code colors, well, you have hard coded the colors. Changing the theme is not going to work.
So, Swing has been with us for 30 years and we kind of know how to deal with it. But I think since then, Android developers have been offered like a nicer programming model in many cases, right? This whole reactive thing where you don't have to go and do add listener and remove listener and all the UI bugs you've seen in various...
Declarative and reactive.
What's that?
Declarative and reactive.
Yes. Right. So we've had lots of UI bugs over the years, when sort of a dialog gets in the wrong state, because, when you enable this thing, that whole thing has to be updated and so on. And in Swing, that was hard to do. And it's very easy with Compose. Right. So I think that's kind of where we're heading into now, is that we have Compose from the Romain's team for Android developers, but JetBrains has built on top of that to make it available for desktop. Can you sort of talk a bit about that?
Yeah. So JetBrains has taken what Google has created, Jetpack Compose, which is the Android-only version of Compose, but it's entirely built on Kotlin and the Kotlin compiler, which is, turns out, fairly easy to port to other platforms. So what JetBrains has done is they've taken that work and they've said, hey, one second, this stuff can run fairly easily with minor changes onto JVM on the desktop, for example. And that was the first thing they did. They created Compose for desktop. After some time, probably realized that, hey, we can actually port this to other platforms as well. And that's how Compose Multi-Platform was born. And now it incorporates Compose for desktop, which is the part that we will use in Studio and we will talk about.
So you mentioned Kotlin, which is certainly an important part of the equation, but there's other pieces that they would also have to get working there. And I believe they're using SKIA for the rendering engine, right? Because at the bottom layer, it's got to figure out how to draw the pixels on whatever platform you happen to be on.
Yeah, absolutely. It turns out that a lot of the UI we see every day is rendered by SKIA. And this is just
they create a library called Skiko, so SKIA for Kotlin, I imagine.
Yeah, it's essentially Kotlin JNI bindings down to the SKIA C++.
It's interesting because it's similar to what we ended up doing in layout previews, right? Where a long time ago, when we were doing previews of your XML UI in Android Studio, we would emulate the rendering of Android using Java 2D, which is what's underneath Swing on Java for desktop. But then because of concerns regarding fidelity, we switched to using SKIA on desktop because SKIA is itself a multi-platform tool. It's used by Chrome, it's used by Flutter, or it was used by Flutter, it's used by many other products. And so it made sense for JetBrains to do that because then they can guarantee that if you render a circle on Android, it should look the same on desktop. It's using the same rendering engine.
Yeah, and plus Compose was already built on top of SKIA in one way or another, so it was an obvious choice to just say, oh, we'll just use the same technology to render.
And it was a good choice because, for instance, when we added the ability to create runtime shaders in Android API something, JetBrains was able to add that to Compose for desktop because they're using SKIA. If they had been, stuck with Java 2D or another renderer, it would have been very difficult to make that compatible.
Yeah, and the language is not exactly identical. I think AGSL is slightly different from SKSL, which is the SKIA shader language, but it's mostly similar.
All right, so now I think there's the Compose technology, the revalidation and all that stuff, and then there's actually the widgets, right? Like out of the box, you also need a button and so on, right? So did they just use Jetpack Compose widgets for that? So like if I run IntelliJ, is it going to look like an Android app?
What are Jetpack Compose widgets?
Maybe the material widgets.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's what I call them.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Compose is built in multiple layers, and we have a layer called Foundation that gives you the foundation for building widgets easily. And that's where you'll find the layouts, for instance, because those don't have visual elements. What we commonly call widgets, so the buttons and so on, the ones we offer are part of the material layer. But Compose was designed so that you can build your own layer. If you don't want to use material, that's where Foundation comes in, where you can rely on that to build your own widgets. So to answer your question, with Compose for desktop, you can use material components if you want.
So if I run IntelliJ and I want to make a new file, is there like a large fab button in the bottom right, like a large purple plus button like in Gmail?
I mean, you can put one, but I wouldn't recommend using material theme in IntelliJ.
This was what we call in the business a leading question. So so tell us about Joule.
Yeah, so Joule is a library that I started with some people when I was working at JetBrains, and now I'm still working on from the Google side. It's something we're actively working with JetBrains on because it's the foundation for all our efforts to bring Compose for Desktop into the IDE. The reason for that is that, as you mentioned, by default, Compose for Desktop and Compose Multiplatform offer the material themes, but they don't look right in the IDE because the IDE has its own design language, which is called IntUI for the new theme. I don't know if it had a specific name for the old theme. I just called it Darkula and IntelliJ Live.
I called it Darkula and Lightula for people who didn't.
Yeah.
I think like Chet, Romain, actually, you're a Lightula person.
I use the light mode. It's so much better than the dark mode.
I'm
dark IDEs are so depressing.
Yep.
I use light theme for the coding IDE, for the host IDE, and dark mode for the guest IDE, so I can distinguish them easily.
I use dark theme except on the bus. When there's glare, then I switch to light theme. But anyway,
Yeah, so because you have a lot of components with material, but they're not necessarily they don't look, but also necessarily don't behave the same way as the components that we have in Swing behave.
Well, and they're not desktop optimized, right? They were designed for mobile and touchscreen interactions.
Absolutely. So what we are building in Joule is a theme and a set of components that match as closely as possible the Swing implementation of the IntUI specs. Now,
meaning they're themable.
Yes, they're themable, although the main goal is not to let people tweak the hell out of everything. The main goal is to get something that you run and it looks okay and it looks like it belongs in the IDE or it belongs in a Java desktop application or a Kotlin desktop application.
So if one window in the IDE switches to Compose for Desktop with Joule and they have a button, and there's another existing older window with a button, those buttons should look the same. It shouldn't have that uncanny valley of something is
they
wrong.
should look as much as possible the same. There will be, if you go pixel peeping, there will be differences because of what Romain was mentioning earlier, which is Swing uses Java 2D to render stuff, but we use SKIA. So the anti-aliasing is going to be slightly different. So there might be a 10% difference in some pixels.
Thankfully, we have really high density displays now, so it's really hard to tell the difference.
Yeah. And we go with the accessibility magnifier to look at every single pixel. It's like, oh, if we tweak this a bit, does it look a bit closer to what we get in Swing or not? And text render.
As long as they're both clear, because I think the biggest difference is like the sub-pixel LCD anti-aliasing, right? But as long as they both have that, and they use the same fonts. I mean, to me, the biggest difference between Windows and Mac, when I look at sort of the OS, the fonts, they're both doing sub-pixel LCD anti-aliasing. It's hard to say that quickly.
They're doing it very different.
But they have very different fonts too. And so to me, like the Mac fonts always seemed heavier, like denser.
It's not that the font is heavier and denser, it's that their anti-aliasing is denser and heavier. Like it's an actual choice.
And they're also not doing...
They don't do the RGB.
They're not doing the sub-pixel anti-aliasing anymore. They stopped a few years back because they ship Retina displays everywhere, so they don't need it.
Well, also there are multiple... Putting my text person hat on. There are multiple ways to do sub-pixel anti-aliasing. One is still grayscale, but you take into account the position within a pixel to figure it out. They're probably still doing that.
Yeah.
But what I think you're referring to, Tor, is what Windows calls clear type, which is when you use the RGB channels of the anti-aliasing to like do sub-pixel anti-aliasing. And some people don't like it because you can see fringing. Hard to see now on high-density displays. But yes, to your point, you need to match that on every platform to look and feel native.
Yeah. The good thing is that SKIA has a very good text rendering engine because, it's used by Chrome, and Chrome, surprisingly...
cares about text.
Yeah. It has a lot of text rendering, so SKIA mostly gets it right.
Yeah, I think it even differs on Windows to the platform APIs to be able to replicate the right anti-aliasing. Chet?
Are there any differences in behavior? So we talked about like rendering and text rendering and anti-aliasing, but are there any subtle differences in like this is how you click, this is how a component responds, and the way that that's processed through the stack in Java 2D versus the way it's being handled in Joule and SKIA and whatever?
I think at a fundamental level there might be some differences, but you have to remember that in Compose for Desktop, at the end of the day, you're still running on top of Swing or AWT, which is the predecessor to Swing, and Swing is built on.
Well, sorry to interrupt, but when you mean you run on top of Swing, it's kind of like Compose on Android, where we have interrupts. Yes. You can host Compose inside views, and so that's how it works with Swing, right?
Yeah,
and there's a view at the most fundamental layer.
Right.
There's a view because that's how we talked.
Yeah, I want to make that distinction because I don't want folks to think that Compose for Desktop uses Swing like to do its rendering, or like when you display text, it's not creating Swing widgets.
It's not. So there, at the Swing level, there is a Compose panel, which is the equivalent of the Compose view on Android, and the idea is the same that we have in Jetpack Compose, where the Compose hierarchy will be hosted by an Android view inside of a traditional activity, and on desktop is kind of the same. The Compose for Desktop leaves the windowing part to Swing. So Swing is still in charge of creating the windows and talking to the US to manage.
So just like on Android, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's exactly the same. So the level at which Compose comes into play is the same on both platforms, which means that some things like input from the mouse or the keyboard, they still go through Swing. So there might be some slight differences in how Compose and Swing handle, for example, focus traversal, but they're not going to be as huge because at the end of the day that they have a common base.
I'm remembering some of the difficult portions that I've run into in using the IDE and sort of knowing how Swing works a little bit under the hood. where the corner cases can get tricky, and I'm assuming the corner cases are going to differ as well. Like Tor mentioned modal dialogues, like that will occasionally cause a problem where something will pop up and stick around longer than you wanted it to, or dragging a window to be sized across two screens or between screens.
Well, one I remember really well, do you remember heavyweight and lightweight
I
components?
was just about to mention that because they're back.
Yes, and in fact, we have, a perfect transition to something in Joule here, right? Because one of the things that we are not shipping in Studio, which our users have complained about a lot, and it's one of the top voted issues, is that people want support for Markdown files in the IDE. Because lots and lots of projects now will have a readme.md at the top, very common. And in IntelliJ, if you open a project, it'll open that file and you kind of get a nice WYSIWYG rendering of the README. And we don't have that. And the reason we don't is that the way that's implemented in IntelliJ is by actually embedding, a whole Chromium, instance, basically, like WebKit or whatever it's called behind the scenes. And we just haven't done that because it's big. And then we have to make sure we security patch it and all that stuff all the time. So we haven't done it. But there's this intriguing new possibility that maybe we can do this with Compose for Desktop. And Sid, can you talk about your Markdown project?
Yeah. So as part of working on Joule, at some point I was like, I wonder how difficult it would be to render a Markdown document using Compose.
Famous last words.
Yeah, first of all, what is Markdown? As in, like, where's the spec?
No, I'm thinking the phrase, how hard could it be? How many programs have said that?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway.
It's a 2 days project that turns out 6 months down the line, we still have bugs and things that we need to implement. But, answering to Romain's question, Markdown, what is Markdown? Markdown is a very loosely defined markup format.
It's a way of life.
Yeah, it's more of a vibe, if you will.
I discovered recently that the way you force it to not flow text is to put 2 extra spaces at the end of a line.
Yes. Which
of
is
course,
very intuitive.
That lights up in code review tools like, trailing space. So I have to, every time I do that deliberately, I have to put comment going here on purpose.
Yeah. So the Markdown specs are pretty much dumped in a blog post from, I think, 2006. And they're very vague. They don't cover a lot of edge cases. The author, I think, is John Gruber, if I'm not mistaken.
Was it John Gruber or was it Mark?
It was on Daring Fireball. So so
John Gruber.
Yeah. So they decided that they weren't interested in improving the specs. It's like the spec for us is what is on the blog post. So what was born out of that were things like GitHub flavored Markdown, and then later that sort of went with Common Mark, which is, as far as I know, the most complete and exhaustive spec that we have for a Markdown-like form.
And they don't just have a spec; they actually have parsers as well.
Yeah. So the reason why I thought, this cannot be too hard, is that at least the parser side is already done. They have a Java library that is fairly easy to use that we, I think, already use in Studio for something, I'm not sure. But that allows you to take a chunk of Markdown and get essentially a DOM out of it. It parses it, creates the models. And what you have to do is take those models, transform them into something that you can then render with Compose.
You just have to render them.
Yeah, you just have to render them.
Rendering a table, how hard could it be?
Yeah, I mean, the table we don't have yet, because turns out there is no table layout in Compose.
Yeah.
There was one, but it's not there anymore. So to support tables in Markdown, we're having to take a step back, which is create a table layout first. And then using that, we're able to render the tables, because we can create the DOM for the tables easily enough, but we don't have a way to render them. And fundamentally, the Joule Markdown renderer is a translator from the Common Mark output, the DOM it creates, into a hierarchy of Compose components. Now, that sounds easy, but it is not that easy, because nothing ever is.
Well, it would be like saying, you have an HTML parser that gives you a DOM, and now all you have to do is render the web page.
It's basically a browser task, right?
Yeah. Well, at least we don't have JavaScript and CSS.
Yeah.
True.
So there's that.
So I thought you were going in a different direction to this, because I don't know any of the internals about this project, which is, maybe there's a possibility of actually rendering HTML. But no, you're talking specifically about rendering Markdown, because I've hit the same problem in another area, which is profiler output trace. What's the current version of that thing that uses a
Systrace?
HTML viewer? Systrace, but there's the
Perfetto?
new version. Yeah,
Perfetto?
Perfetto. Right, because like we have a way to view that stuff inside of Studio, but it was all custom done because that's the way you need to do it inside of Studio. So you can't really get the full output that you can get by going to a web page. So I thought, oh, maybe this is going to happen, but
No.
apparently no.
Well,
But we'll
I
have Markdown.
Yeah, I mean, I think, that was something Seb worked on before because he was on StudioBot and we get Markdown out of the model. And then what were we rendering? Well, when you see the sort of the styled text in StudioBot, that was basically Seb rendering Markdown to HTML.
Yeah.
But now, so just, out of curiosity, so you worked on StudioBot UI and you're going, hey, how do I render Markdown? Why would you be thinking those things?
So in Swing, as you mentioned, we take the Markdown that the model returns and we transform it using the common mark library. It can render the Markdown into HTML because Swing, to do rich text in Swing, you need to pass it HTML. But it's like HTML3.
Yeah, I was going to say the reason
3.2.
for that's like Swing came out in 97. So back then it was plausible to create your own HTML widget that fully supported HTML. But now,
Yeah.
I mean, you would need a full-blown web browser, right?
Yeah, it's HTML 3.2, I think CSS1.
With some extensions because you can actually embed Swing widgets in your HTML stream.
Yes,
Yeah, it's pretty
but
cool.
also some parts of CSS turns out don't work.
Right.
So yeah, it's an interesting...
Yeah, we use it in a number of places in Studio, and we also have to work really, like, for example, the assistant, the Firebase assistant, all that stuff that's using HTML viewer. What's new assistant also? And we have to be very careful with a subset of HTML we're using, and it kind of, it's very limiting.
Yeah, but it's kind of funny because in Swing, so you see the IDE and it's like, oh, this is a native UI, but a lot of it is actually HTML under the hood because Swing only understands basic HTML to do, I need a part of a string to be bold. That whole string needs to be HTML, and then the Swing component will under the hood create an HTML view and use that to understand, oh, okay, there is a run that is bold here, so I will render it slightly
Yeah,
differently.
but it's similar on Android when we have those APIs, HTML.frame HTML or something that will generate, the spans for you. So it's not, because you're using HTML doesn't mean there's a Chromium instance.
Yeah, I think IntelliJ also has a special, label that's taught how to do simple HTML.
Right.
Yeah, there are very specialized labels that allow you, for example, to put a link at the end or something like that. Because for some use cases, it doesn't make sense to use the HTML because obviously it's slower than just having two labels one next to the other and just handling the layout or where the second one is going to go.
Yeah. So anyway, you had implemented HTML, and then you were thinking, how do I render Markdown to Compose? And why would you be thinking about that?
Yeah, so the reason is we are rewriting the UI of the Gemini and Android Studio chat tool window, well, I say we, mostly I so far, into Compose for Desktop and Joule. So a lot of the features that we are implementing in Joule come from our need to have this rich support for Markdown rendering, because again, the model gives us Markdown. So why don't we render the Markdown directly? We don't need to translate it to HTML and then render it.
Parse the Markdown, translate to HTML, parse the HTML, rendering back.
Yeah, that would make no sense.
My biggest pet peeve, which Seb heard about a lot, is the selection handling in StudioBot 1.0, right? Like you can't put if this was, barred, you can start swipe selecting across code snippets and answers and sort of get it. That doesn't work because what we did in Swing is just kind of actually put top level IntelliJ editor for code snippets, HTML views and so on. And this whole Compose rewrite unlocks so many things in terms of, productivity for Seb doing the UI, but also this ability to manage much more cleverly what's visible.
And part of it is not just because, we have our own Markdown renderer, but Compose from the get-go was designed to be able to have a selection that crosses multiple widgets, which is typically not what happens in UI toolkits.
No, because in Swing, we try to minimize it as much as possible, but in Swing, there's just no way to have a selection span multiple components. But in Compose, we can, because there is a selection container, I think is the name of the composable. And essentially anything you put in there now can be selected, which is awesome. And when I added that and showed it to Tor, it was like, oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, it was because this is one of those things, right? Where
You're welcome, Tor.
Not just that. I mean, we also had to kind of limit the scroll back because, with the heavyweight approach before, it would get slower and slower the more questions you have. And with Compose, this will be solved. So, so there's the whole rewrite to Compose that we're doing in StudioBot. In fact, the new profiler UI that we shipped earlier this year, that is all written in Compose for desktop. And in fact, I think that our team policy now is that new UI code. So the earlier question about Swing, yes, that was true until recently. And now our new UI work all uses Compose for desktop. And it's enabled by this Joule work, right? That is sort of making it possible to have this look as if it was written in Swing, but just to get the developer productivity, scalability, cross-component selection, all of it, right?
Yeah, and that's not all because, Swing works, and especially in IntelliJ platform, it's much easier to do Swing than elsewhere. But Swing comes with a learning curve. It comes with a lot of magic in the sense that you have a bunch of stringly typed magic APIs like client properties that you need to know if you want to do stuff.
To be fair, there's also a learning curve for Compose. And so we had a bunch of engineers in Studio who were very comfortable with Swing, used it for years, and they were kind of not fans initially of this.
Yes, but I got now they have the Compose team sitting next to them and they can come ask questions.
It's virtuous for us to use the things where, similar to what we're shipping. So it's all good. But the good news is a couple of weeks ago, I heard from someone who, now that they used it a few weeks in anger, wow, this is actually really nice. There's that epiphany you get when you're so used to like, okay, I need this to update based on this other thing. Let me add some listeners. And when you just put like an if else around it, it's kind of amazing. And I had the same experience myself last summer. We had no meetings weeks for a couple of weeks. So I tried to write a real Android app. And the first day it's like, oh, what is this mutable state? This is all weird, right? But then when you get past that, it gets really good.
When it clicks, it just unlocks the productivity. Yeah. Like I've seen it with myself, where to create the timeline, the Swing version of the timeline in the Gemini chat took, 4 months to get to the initial launching state. And I got, apart from a couple of things that weren't possible yet, I think I made a prototype in Compose in 2 days that I was just like, oh yeah, sure, the corners are not perfect, but that's a small fix to do. I have a prototype in 2 days, maybe slightly less than 2 days. So yeah, that's the kind of productivity boost that we can get and we're looking forward to. An interesting anecdote on the Toolbox side is that it used to be done in Electron. The first versions of Toolbox were essentially a web app that had a bunch of custom native code, if I recall correctly, to handle windowing and
integration with menu bar.
Menu bar integration and all that stuff. And at some point, I'm not sure why, but they decided to rewrite it in Compose. And just when they were done with it, they realized that it was using a lot less RAM, a lot less CPU, which is good for something that is supposed to be, always running, but tucked in the background and not using your resources unless it's needed. And that was where Joule was also born from, because the Joule name was decided by the person that was the TL for Toolbox at the time. When we talked with them, we're like, oh, folks, we want to try an experiment in package search, doing some Compose for desktop to see how it is. But you have already a library of components because, to create the Toolbox UI.
That looked like other JetBrains products. That was probably what.
Yeah, but it looked like the web components right. Because, of course, Toolbox came from the web. So the Electron version was using all the JetBrains web components, which are different from the IDE components. So we started from there, and then we realized that, actually, it is doable. So why don't we create a way for those components to look exactly like the IDE, which sounds simple, but as always, the devil is in the details. And we ended up having to create what we call the bridge, which is a component that runs in the IntelliJ platform that reads and scoops up all the values from the Swing look and feel and creates the theme that then the Joule components use to render.
Right. So I was going to get to that because I think it hasn't been clear in the discussion unless your listeners are paying close attention. So you talked about using Joule in the IDE, right? But then you mentioned Toolbox, which is a standalone application. And knowing Joule, because I've used it, it has two sets of artifacts. There's the standalone ones and the plugin ones. So can you explain the difference and why we have both?
Also to clarify, Toolbox does not use Joule. Joule was born from Toolbox, but it doesn't. It's a separate code base still. I think Toolbox is still closed source. So
who knows?
So in Joule, we are trying to accommodate two main use cases. The one that is, for our intents and purposes, the most important one is the ability to run in the IDE, to respond to IDE theme changes, to respond to IDE events, and make sure that we're always consistent with the Swing UI. The goal of the goal of Joule is to not let people understand that it's not Swing. If you cannot tell it's not Swing, we have won. Except then we can do other stuff that kind of give the game away. But that is the bridge side, the IDE side. And then we have what we call standalone. Standalone is essentially you use exactly the same components, but a different theme declaration. And you can run those components outside of the IDE or the IntelliJ platform. That is, for example, you want to create a desktop app using Compose for Desktop, and you don't want to use material components, but you want to use something that is more optimized for desktop. So you would use Joule standalone. The main difference is that because we're not running in IntelliJ platform, we don't have access to the theme from the IntelliJ platform. So what we have done is we have recreated the int UI, so the new UI, light and dark themes, and kind of hard-coded them into the Joule standalone. So your app will look almost exactly as if it were running in the IDE.
Right. So the use case you just described is exactly what I did. I built a desktop app, and I started with the material widgets. It was fine, but it works. It works, but the app never felt like modern or like a desktop app. So then I switched to Joule. It was nice because you can have the on macOS, for instance, the unified title bar that you see in IntelliJ or Android Studio. You get widgets that have sizes that are better, I think, for mouse keyboard interaction. So it was kind of like a really nice way to get a good-looking desktop app out of the box, reusing knowledge I have from Android to be able to build a tool that I wanted to
a couple episodes ago, we talked about optimizations, and you, Romain, had written a tool where you could sort of, point to some bytecode in class, and you can sort of see this is the one that you've wrote.
Yeah, it's to compile and disassemble Kotlin code. So that's the tool I'm talking about. And this is, and I think that's the cool thing about Compose for Desktop when you're an Android developer. I've done that multiple times where to do experiments or small tools, I can just, go build it. Yep. I don't need to spend a ton of time on it. It's not a product, but just being able to get off the ground quickly is really nice.
And most importantly, support dark theme. So
I did not do that.
You get it out of the box, right? Wait, did you not hook that up?
No, it's complicated.
Okay, all right.
Because I have syntax highlighting and all that.
Talk.
So
it's Romain is kind of cheating in his tool. Is using Swing components.
There is some interop at play. No, but it's great. Like for instance, I remember when I was experimenting with color spaces, like new algorithms for Compose, I need to visualize stuff. So I built quickly a Compose for Desktop app. We use mostly the same code from Android. You play there. Once you have something that works, you copy it back into your Android project. It's a great way to work.
One of our goals in Joule is to be able, as I was saying earlier, to have the code, the components that you write to be portable without any change between the standalone and the bridge, the IDE versions of your code base. That is because we believe that is important, to be able to quickly iterate on things, because of course you have just a simple window that only contains that component. It's much easier to test and play with than
the full-blown
compiling the IDE and running the IDE.
I imagine that's how you build the Markdown renderer, right?
Yes.
When you have to iterate on that, you don't do it in the IDE.
Yeah. I would do it in standalone, and even now, if I create a new component, I'll create it probably with the standalone version, and then make sure it works in the IDE.
Speaking as a studio person, right? Like what you really want is live edit. But of course, so far, we're not supporting Compose Desktop. We're focusing on the Android Compose. But that would be nice one day if we could have a feature like that.
Yeah, I would love that.
By the way, I used the Markdown renderer recently in my tool because I need to render styled documentation, and it was super easy to use, and I was glad, because at first, it's like, oh, do I need to use HTML3 with Swing interrupt, or do I need to like embed Chromium? Seems like a little overkill.
No.
So that was a perfect solution. That's exactly what I wanted.
Yeah, that also kind of fills a gap, because right now in Compose for desktop, there isn't an easy way like there is in Jetpack Compose to have rich text coming from your resources. There isn't, like, we don't have support for HTML like we do have on Jetpack Compose. But also, I think there is one fundamental difference between using Markdown and using HTML for your rich text, which is HTML can carry styling, Markdown does not. So Markdown, and that's an interesting difference between the Swing implementation of using HTML, you can literally have CSS into your HTML and say, oh, this text is blue. And
so basically, the app does not control the final.
Yeah, you cannot control the styling. And that's particularly problematic if you have user input, because you want to know the structure, but you don't want to impose the styling, because the styling should come from the context of the application. For example,
especially for dark mode.
Yeah. You want to have light mode and dark mode. You don't want to have a string resource that has different versions for light and dark, but also you don't want, you ideally want to have your strings, your content agnostic of the theme in general, because maybe someone will decide to render that Markdown as if it were on GitHub. So using a certain font, a certain line height and colors and whatnot. Or maybe they want to render it as if it were native UI in the IDE. So that is where using Markdown gives us a lot of flexibility. And also it allows us to split the parsing of the Markdown from the rendering of the Markdown. Because at the end of the day, what we need to do is we take block level Markdown nodes and transform them into Compose components. And inside of those components, we have annotated strings.
I have a feature request. That's kind of expected of me on this podcast. But Romain showed me this amazing dialect of Markdown called Markdeep.
Mm-hmm.
And so you were using it for all the documentation for Filament. And I've shamelessly then started using it for all the lint documentation.
So good.
And yes, so it's basically, it just adds a lot more conventions, right? So for example, there are things in there to make sure that it doesn't get confused, right? But you can add ASCII art, and then it costs a library to actually turn it into like nice tables, so you can do like diagrams.
You can do flowcharts.
Yeah, it's really kind of amazing. It's a way to sort of get book quality kind of layout. It would be nice to have a version of that. I don't know how easy it is, because I think that's using a bunch of other libraries.
I think it would be hard because, it does things like it can render diagrams, some pretty complex diagrams.
Is it using Mermaid?
No, it's custom.
The GitHub flavor Markdown can render Mermaid ASCII art.
Right. So GitHub Markdown has made huge steps. You should look at Markdeep, but some of the features are pretty advanced. For instance, when you have images or code snippets, you can automatically generate references like you would in a book. So you can automatically create links, they get numbered. One feature I love is the embedded math rendering. So you can render equations, which is probably useful for StudioBot.
It's also in the GitHub flavor Markdown spec.
Yeah, I did that.
The problem is, all those things I've looked into and I've decided they're not in scope for now, because they require either to write a parser and rendering for that stuff, or to find a library that works in Compose, which is not.
I think as long as we're going further, why stop at Markdeep? Just support LaTeX straight up.
Yeah.
Well, Markdeep is basically LaTeX for.
Well, no. What's really nice about Markdeep is that you can open the file and look at it, and like Markdown, it's readable as ASCII on its own. So you don't have to like do an interpreter in your head. But what's clever about Markdeep is it actually has an HTML extension. So on the very bottom of the file, there's like a link that sort of causes it to render so if you just open this file in a browser, now it's beautifully rendered. So it has the nice property of having both like high level rendering and a web page, which you can then turn into a PDF, which I think you do, or the ASCII makes sense. It's and that problem with LaTeX is that it's like
when you read it doesn't make sense.
You need to know LaTeX too.
Yeah. But just like in GitHub, the math equations, for instance, that's the LaTeX syntax.
Yeah.
Now, one thing I want to say about the Markdown renderer that I think might interest some of the listeners that, so you have the parser, but you can also just use the API directly. And for instance, in my case, I'm generating documentation. So I parse that documentation, but then I wanted to add a title and then a footer with a link to a documentation. And to add those, instead of injecting Markdown in the string I parse.
Sounds very easy, but okay.
I just use, no, but instead I just use directly there's a Node API. It's very easy to use. So it's a nice way to do like complex text styling that's structured.
Another thing, we're not using it for that, but theoretically, KDoc, the Kotlin documentation, is a Markdown-like syntax. So you could technically also, if you were reading Kotlin code in Kotlin Explorer, you could render the documentation that way as well.
That's something IntelliJ added semi-recently, right? Is that when I looked for, the first they did it for Java. So when you look at a Java doc, it's rendered, as, with style text as opposed
to reader mode.
Reader mode, exactly. Yes. I don't know if they've done it for Kotlin yet.
No, they did.
They did, okay.
I use it all the time because that's the only way, because the Markdown for Kotlin can be finicky.
Well, certainly the IntelliJ, it used to be that the IntelliJ implementation, like if you do show documentation in IntelliJ, it is not doing proper Markdown rendering. It's not the same as the KDoc engine. KDoc itself probably uses Common Mark, but certainly the in-IDE one does some things
HTML, I think. So I think it renders the mark. I'm not sure, but the way I would do it is I would take the Markdown, render it into HTML, and feed it to Swing.
So they don't. Their Markdown parser is not Common Mark. They have their own whatever it is.
They have the JetBrains. It's on GitHub, but JetBrains Markdown renderer, which has some weird edge cases, and it is not fully compliant with the Common Mark spec.
Yeah,
so there are some minor differences.
So I worked on the KDoc formatter, as you know, right, which is now a KT format, and there were a bunch of debates there because it was following what KDoc should do, and that was my test. I was like, okay, what does KDoc do? Okay, I'm going to do that, right? Whereas like in the IDE, when they were integrated, they were complaining because IntelliJ was showing something different.
Yeah,
and so it would be good if it was all unified, so that what you get in the IDE for reader mode actually is what you're going to get in KDoc. Because if not, that would be bad.
So if our listeners want to write a Compose for desktop app and they want to use Joule, where do you find Joule?
So Joule is on GitHub under the JetBrains organization.
It's at HTTP.
No, but is it published on Maven Central?
No. So right now the setup is a bit convoluted because we are not at 1.0 yet. So there are no, I want to put my warnings there. There are no guarantees of binary compatibility. We try to not break stuff as much as we can, but we're still figuring things out. So there are changes that break
sometimes there are breakages.
Sorry, but
it's not a big deal.
And I think all of us have been guests on your podcast. So thank you for returning the favor. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So for about, I think 2.5, 3 years, I forget how much that's been going on. But with a friend of mine, Ivan, we do, I would say weekly, but these days it's been a bit more sporadic. But generally we do Wednesday streams about Android development. We have had all of you as guests talking about different things. We talked about shapes last time with Chet, I think. We talked about, we're going to be talking in a couple of weeks.
Oh, yeah, it's true.
As well, about Kotlin performance implementations. And we've talked about lint.
Shocker.
Unsurprisingly. Yeah. But yeah, the idea is that we have a bunch of guests that come and explain things to us. To me, it's very good because I learn a lot of things from people that are very good at what they do. And also because I haven't been doing Android development for a number of years at this point, it allows me to keep up with whatever's happening in the Android.
No, it's a lot of people who are good at pretending they're good at what they do.
Oh, come on. That's not what we all do.
Yeah.
All right, so that's Coding with Italians?
Yeah, that's Code with Italians. You can find it on Twitch for the streams, and then we upload all the episodes on YouTube. I forget how many streams we have, but it's a lot of them. I would recommend not looking at the first 10 of them because they weren't particularly good. We're still trying to figure out how things work.
Whereas the original ADB episodes, classics,
of
course, still
good.
To this day.
Still
to this day, like a good vintage.
Yeah.
Anything else that we forgot to talk about? I guess people should look out for a new refreshed UI of Gemini and Android Studio.
Yeah, it's going to be ready when it's ready.
Yeah.
Because we don't commit to anything.
That's right.
Yeah, I would say not really a question, but more like if you do end up using Joule, for whatever, do let us know, because we'd love to know who's using it outside of the use cases we know of. I know that there are some companies that are using it for internal tooling and experimenting with it, and it's super exciting and also allows us to prioritize what we do and how we do things. So please let us know if you use it. If you find any bugs, let us.
Yeah, and we're integrating the Markdown thing to actually give you Markdown preview in Studio, but it's not feature complete for all the so maybe if someone's interested in that, that could be a fun thing too.
Where are they supposed to let you know about this?
On the GitHub repo.
Okay.
So it should be github.com/jetbrains/jewel.
Is that http://?
There's an S somewhere.
Okay,
as
all right,
well.
got it. All right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.